I guess this would be the first, maybe the second video in this series that I'm doing. Moving on with the central topic of the video, I'm talking about the decades-long regression of console gaming. When it comes to gaming, whether you're on PC or console, have you noticed that everything has gotten slower, more expensive, wastes more time, and is generally less about the experience of playing games than it is about, these game studios and publications profiteering from you and extracting data from you? That's something I've noticed, among other things, but games used to be about the games themselves, the gameplay, the core experience of it all. It's for this reason that The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time excuse me, is by many sources, even from critical sources, the highest rated game of all time, nearly 30 years later, if not 30 years later. And on the topic of the Nintendo 64, that being a Nintendo 64 game, the console itself had 4 megabytes of RAM, which could optionally be expanded to a whopping 8 megabytes of RAM, I know. And not only was it 8 megabytes of RAM, it was clocked at an equivalent speed of 500 megahertz. The Nintendo 64 processor was a 32-bit NEC VR4300, which was clocked at 93.75 megahertz. And then it had an additional upstream processor, if you want to call it upstream, or a master processor, or the main processor, whatever. I'm not getting too into the weeds of it. I'm calling it an upstream processor for the sake of this video. And it was known as the Reality coprocessor, which was clocked at 62.5 megahertz. There was no dedicated graphics card. The entire system consumed, and this is from memory, I think it consumed like 35 watts of power. Not a lot of power at all, right? And you compare that to today's hardware, these measly specifications of the Nintendo 64 compared to today's hardware. I mean, let that sink in. The Nintendo 64, when you put a cartridge in the console and turn the power button, the game loaded instantly. Instantly. This was 30 years ago. It wouldn't boot up into an operating system. It didn't have like a weird dashboard. It didn't force you to make accounts. It didn't force you to agree to policies and end-user license agreements that are essentially coercion. Many of these games on the Nintendo 64 didn't even have loading screens. Banjo and Kazooie, for example, it didn't have loading screens between transitions between worlds, and the worlds were pretty big, right? There was no loading screen. There was an image of a jiggy, the puzzle piece that would shrink as you were entering a tunnel, or whatever the demarc point was for the next area, and then it would expand, and that was it. It was like a PowerPoint presentation effect, where you have the slide effects. That's pretty much what it is. That's all it was. You didn't sit there and wait for a bar to load. You didn't sit there and wait for nothing to load. Nothing. It was like a transition effect, and it happened in seconds. Moving on, the performance of computational devices are sometimes measured in flops, or flops are floating point operations per second. It's not a perfect metric. I will admit it right now. I needed some kind of baseline universal metric for the sake of this video. I know it's not perfect. I know it's controversial. Trust me, I'm fully aware. It's not a real-world benchmark. It's also not a synthetic benchmark. But it's the best I can do, right? Nobody's out here porting Cinebench to the Nintendo 64. Right? If you know somebody that can do that, I will gladly remake this part of the video and rerun my numbers and get the math to be slightly more accurate. But for the sake of this video moving on, I'm going to be comparing performance from the Nintendo 64 to modern console in flops. The Nintendo 64 put out 94 megaflops of performance. Keep that in mind, because in 2026, hardware limitations don't exist. I know, hold on, hear me out. Sounds crazy, sounds absolutely deranged and insane, but hardware limitations really don't exist. We have a problem with software. We do not have a problem with hardware. The hardware today is exponentially faster and more powerful than it was in September of 1996 when the Nintendo 64 came out. And yet, somehow, everything has become slower. In my eyes, from my perspective, this is the result of bloated and unoptimized software. There's no excuse for this, really, there isn't. Computers and consoles don't have to be this way. They really don't. Now, the PlayStation 5 has a sustained 9.2 teraflops of performance, and the Xbox Series X produces 12.1 teraflops of performance. By this metric, these two modern consoles are an average of 162,000 times more powerful than the Nintendo 64. That is incomprehensible. That's crazy. That's crazy. And aside from the raw performance, the overall gaming experience is much different. You remember how I said when you turned the console on, the Nintendo 64, it booted the game instantly. No loading screens, no accounts, no bullshit. You got right into the action. With consoles today, it's not the same. It's not the same at all. You sit down, you turn it on, it takes forever to boot. Once it's booted, you gotta make an account, you gotta connect to the internet, then you're coerced to agree to some privacy policy, and then coerced to agree to some terms of usage, probably somehow sell your soul to the devil. And after that, you sit through gigabytes and gigabytes of system firmware updates. Then you have to install the games, which are often hundreds of gigabytes on their own. Then you launch the game, and then there's an unskippable account creation process if it's an online multiplayer game. And then after the account creation process, which is used for data mining, they're just harvesting data off you. There's no legitimate, honest reason for you to have to make an account for a third-party launcher. But I digress. After you make that second account, you are forced to sit through an unskippable tutorial followed by ridiculous amounts of loading screens that take forever. Now, why are there more loading screens and loading time on consoles that are over 162,000 times more powerful than what we had 30 years ago? You kind of get where I'm going with this? You kind of understand when I say we don't have hardware limitations anymore, we have software limitations. Computers were faster when they were slower. And those of us who remember Windows 98, compare it to Windows 11. There's a stark contrast in responsivity. Everything was faster on Windows 98. Everything on Windows 11 takes longer. And Windows 11, much like modern consoles, is larger, slower, and more annoying to deal with than the software of yesteryear, while Windows 98 is more comparable to the older consoles. It was lean, lightning fast, consumed minimal resources, no accounts, no bullshit. The difference really stems in developer mindset. 30 years ago, software engineers were taught that every megabyte mattered. And today, software engineers believe that unused RAM is wasted RAM, which is incredibly stupid, by the way. I don't even have to explain that. And it may have seemed that you kind of went off the track here, but I promise it's all relevant. It's all relevant to the consoles, the console gaming experience, and the regression of software as a whole. With the consoles, now there's installation media. Back then, the media was pre-installed. The games were on the cartridges or on the discs, right? They didn't contain installers, they didn't contain this, that, or the other. It contained the game, and that's it. Now, there's installation media. Digital downloads, games aren't stored on the disc anymore. The discs nowadays only contain encryption keys for license verification. And then once the license is verified, the content of the disc just points the console in the direction of the download server and says, hey, download this game on this server. That's how you get your game now. Aside from not really owning it anymore, there are problems with that. This is another example of how the experience has been ruined and regressed for decades. And I do find it unacceptable that 30 years ago, the 5 megabyte per second transfer speeds of the Nintendo 64 cartridge were somehow faster than today's NVMe SSDs that these modern consoles contain, which have a throughput of anywhere between 3 and 14 gigabytes per second. So we went from hardware that was 5 megabytes per second, no loading screens, everything was instant, booted up in a second, to NVMe SSDs, which are up to 14 gigabytes per second, and everything takes longer. The problem isn't the hardware, it's the software. This is proof that software has regressed. Poorly written and endlessly bloated software has ruined the console gaming experience, much in the same way that it's ruined the PC gaming experience. And I might make a video on the PC gaming experience later at another date in another schizophrenic rambling video. Just to sum it up, gaming does not have to be this way. It really doesn't. Developers should optimize those consoles. The games should be lightning fast, just as they were 30 years ago. There's no excuse for everything to somehow simultaneously cost more and operates slower than it did 3 decades ago. 3 decades, and everything got slower and slower and slower and consumed more power and cost more money. It doesn't make sense. Those who say Moore's Law is dead are partially correct, because within Moore's Law, yes, it's true that our computational power is doubling, but the equivalent performance and experience seems like it's halving every year because of lazy development, poorly written software. The overall experience of a console appears to have been totally disregarded by every console manufacturer, every single one of them. It's all gotten so ridiculous. I find it crazy. I find it crazy. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. That's not my problem. Anyway, I'm gonna call it there. I think that's a pretty good ramble and rant on my thoughts of console gaming. If you watched this long, thanks for watching. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.